Welcome back to Rachel's Studio, and in today's tutorial we're going to go over some advanced watercolor techniques that I use in almost every painting. But in today's video it's going to be spooky style. So let's go ahead and jump right into these advanced techniques. Some of the things I used you might not necessarily need, and it just depends on what you decide you want to use from the tips that I give you in this tutorial. So let's talk about what I used. One thing I used was this Mr. Clean eraser in conjunction with a stencil like this for the bats. I erased bats, but I found as I was creating this painting something that worked just as well as the magic eraser, which if you're a longtime student of mine anyway, you'll probably have a scrubber. And because I painted this particular kitty on Arches cold press, this scrubber, the stiff scrubber by Royal and Langnickel, worked great. So you don't necessarily need to have Mr. Clean magic eraser, but if you do get a magic eraser, be sure you get original. So that's how I did the bats in this tutorial. It's with this stencil, and when I used paint with the stencil, I found that the best thing to apply paint with the stencil was one of these stencil brushes that I got as part of this 25-piece Craft Smart set off of Amazon, and this was my favorite brush that I use. So you'll see me using that. You'll also see me floundering about trying to use different brushes to apply the black paint. And I'm going to use this Chinese wink. Don't use Chinese wink, use ink. Winks don't do much except make you feel good. But anyway, this is Chinese ink. I got it off Amazon. Once you paint it on and it dries, it is not removable. You can't scrub it like you can lamp black. So just know that. But this is really fun to play with. And in this tutorial, you'll see me paint it on both cold press and hot press to see the difference. But if you don't want to use calligraphy ink, you don't want to mess with buying this, just use lamp black cream consistency on glistening paper, and it will take, if you've never done this, it has taken me so many tries and fails and experiments. So be sure to watch my other black cat tutorials about using lamp black to fur it out to create these fluffy black cats. It's super fun, and it might be a little super frustrating if you are new to this technique, because it does take a little bit of a knack and you've got to practice. I will talk a little bit about my favorite moon that I've ever painted, and that is this moon of Sadie Scary. And I used totally different colors than I ever use, and they are a combination of paints that I learned from handprint.com. The guy that does that website calls it his synthetic black mix, and it's a mix of phthalo green, Daniel Smith permanent brown, and Indanthrone blue. And that mix is specifically for getting inky but transparent looking black that stays black. And if you know anything about watercolor, you know that black watercolor paints tend to have quite a drying shift, meaning as they dry, they get lighter. So this mix doesn't lighten as much when you mix a black from these three colors. And so that's the idea behind synthetic black mix. The side benefit that I found was useful for painting a really textured, dreamy looking moon was all these cauliflower effects. And not every watercolor paint cauliflowers out the same. And so what I just found, just kind of by coincidence and mistake, when I was playing with this synthetic black mix for this painting 1 or 2 years ago, which by the way is a $13 tutorial on my Patreon, is that these three colors cauliflower out really beautifully, kind of like phthalo blue does. Phthalo blue, lamp black, and these colors really make beautiful cauliflowers that are perfect for moon greater effects. If you try to get these kind of cauliflowers with, say, ultramarine blue and cobalt and some heavier granulating paints, they don't have that dreamy effect as well. Speaking of black cats, here's a black cat that's been showing up lately. I'm painting this on Arches cold press 140 pound. I have found that this paper furs out better than other papers in general, but the new Arches cold press of the last 10 years is not as good as the old Arches, so we'll see how this goes. What we're going to do is get water on here and make sure that it's evenly coating the cat. There's no puddles, so we don't, because if you have a puddle here and it's drier here, when we put the ink on the wet paper, it'll bloom out more and he'll have a lump on his back. Another top tip for success with this painting style is know that when you are applying the ink with your brush and you lift up, the ink is going to explode out from wherever you lift your brush. So say you want his backside to have a even curve, you would paint like this with your brush and then maybe come in here and then lift up. Don't go like this because it'll make weird explosions along his back. And what I'm going to do is get everything wet except where I want hard edges. I want a hard edge where his wings come over the fur. I want hard edges around the eyes and the nose. So those elements are going to stay dry. I want the ears to be pretty hard edged. So I will paint water on them, but then I'll blot them up and then paint the ink so they don't fur out. And so I'm going to use a larger brush. This is about a 2-inch wide hockey brush. You can use anything that's large and flat, a mop, whatever. The main thing you want is to try to get your water even. So we're going to paint on our water. I'm going to paint around this wing. Actually, you know what? I might want it to fur out over the wing there, but it won't fur out over this wing. So I am going to paint around this wing. But see how I'm making the water go right across this edge because we want it to fur out there. And I'm going to switch to a smaller brush in a minute to get smaller details in. Again, you don't want your paint to be puddling. You want it to have an even glisten. That's going to be hard edge. And I want my nose to show. I'm going to paint around that too, but making sure this boundary is nice and wet. Again, this is Arches cold press. It historically has furred out the best for me. Then I'm going to use some Chinese ink. You can also use, if you don't have this, get some fresh from the tube lamp black and add just a little water to it, and that will work too. It furs out really cool. Usually it's different every time. I'm going to blot around these ears and go ahead and do them. And see, I lifted up right there and I'm getting a bomb, an ink bomb. So that's what I mean. So let me try to not do that. Lift up in there. You can also try to blot and see if there's an area that is getting too fluffy. You can blot right now. So that's the spot that I really want to be the most furred out right there. Whether or not it will, I don't know. And these I want less furred out. If you want to try to give it some definition by putting in a lighter spot, you can try to lift out. Let's see if it'll let me lift out and put a little bit of water here and then lift it back up and then put more water and then clean it out and then lift that up and sop it up. Lift more water. So I'm just going to do a little more voiceover here. And for this lifting technique that you see me doing, the best time to do a lift when you have wet paint on wet paper is to let it dry a little bit. If you try to lift out with a thirsty brush when your paper is too wet, then it'll just fill back in as you see happening here. And I have to keep working on it. Another thing though that I like to do sometimes, and you'll see me do this, is I'll lift and then I'll drop in some water. Then I'll lift and I'll drop in more water to kind of push out to create these furred out highlights that I'm creating. So that's how I did it, but with a combination of putting in water, lifting it out, putting in water, lifting it out. And here is how it looks on cold press. And here is how it looks on hot press. And it's a lot darker. Hot press is a lot richer looking. So I do like that about hot press, but it furred out more on the cold press. So there are advantages and disadvantages to each paper. And if you'd like to watch the full process of me painting on the hot press paper, be sure to check it out on my Patreon. All right, let's take a look at how I painted the glow around this moon. So I've got my 3/4 oval there, and just any big brush that you have will do. And we're just going to get the whole sky wet, because what we're going to do is drop in colors going from darkest to lightest to create a glowing effect around the moon. So in order to have our watercolors blend themselves instead of us blending them, you get your whole paper wet, not puddling, just evenly glistening. And then we'll go from super thick and creamy, darker paint in the corners, farthest away from the moon, of course, because that's where the sky would be darkest, the farthest away from the moon. So this is cream consistency I'm putting in here, lamp black. And then I'm gonna put a base color of yellow over the moon. I could have done this first and have it go right out into the sky, so that creates moon glow effect into the sky. And so that was about tea consistency. Now I'm going to get some Winsor Violet. I need more Winsor Violet in my palette. In fact, this is about milk consistency, but you can put cream consistency Winsor Violet right next to that black. So it goes from deep black to deep purple to lighter purple. So the more water you add to your paint, the lighter it will get. So as we go in towards the moon, we're going to get lighter and lighter and lighter with our paint. And then I put in milk consistency Holbein Aureolin next to the purple, and then more cream consistency lamp black. And as this dries a little bit, you can add even more cream consistency to the corners to get them super rich and dark. And it's usually pretty hard to get lamp black completely black in one layer. So usually what I do is I let all this dry and then put another layer, which you will see me do. This is going to be cream consistency, super powerful, Winsor Violet, but I'm just putting it right next to the black. And see, this is creating a glowing effect from the moon. And now as it goes into buckling, I'm spattering on some sprinkles of water to give a dreamy, ethereal look. Okay, this is completely dry. Make sure everything is bone dry. It's dry to the touch. And then we're going to get some tea consistency purple, and we're going to paint up to the moon with this glaze. This is what a glaze is. When you paint a watery wash of paint over a dried set underpainting. So I'm dotting up over the wings because I don't want to lose the wings. But see how now we've got that nice hard line between the moon and the background. And as this dries, it'll dry lighter, because that's what watercolor paint does. It dries lighter. So I'm using my 3/4 oval, the biggest brush that I have, and that helps me get this tea consistency glaze on nice and evenly. Now everything's completely dry again. You have to wait for everything to dry completely to put yet another layer of paint over all of this. And this is exactly the process that I used to paint that painting of the cat playing with Christmas lights. Many, many layers and glazes to get this gradiated effect. So I'm just seeing what I need to get a little bit more dramatic. And I think I need more yellow to create that yellow glow coming off the moon. That was my artistic choice. So at this point, you've got to look at your painting. It's going to look different than mine at this point. You have to decide, what more do I need? Do I need some richer darks? You can almost never get too dark darks in those far corners. So yes, I'm going to put more cream consistency over the black. I'm going to put some more cream consistency Winsor Violet over the Winsor Violet parts. And since this is all wet, it just kind of blends together subtly to make a nice, soft, dreamy, gradiated look. And I'm splatting more paint, more water to see if I get any dreamy cauliflowers, but usually on the second to third glaze, you don't. All right, so I'm letting that completely dry. Now that I think I'm happy with my sky, I took off my masking. I just rubbed off my masking with my finger. You can also use a crepe eraser. And just a note, I'm going to work on the moon and put more cauliflowers, but I will just say that my very favorite moon that I ever painted was in the painting I did 1 or 2 years ago of Sadie, Scary Sadie, I think I named it. And that is a tutorial in my Patreon library. And so if you want to watch me paint my best moon, which you could then duplicate that look here, you can watch that moon. And then I'm gonna play with some bat stencils. I wanted to play with stencils and Mr. Clean Eraser for working with stencils. And one thing I've learned with using magic eraser, sometimes it works better than others, depending on what paint you used, what paper you're using, and how the planets are aligned. So I have found that you really need to squeeze almost all the water out of your magic eraser. You do need it damp, but if you go in too wet, it will not have a great effect. The water will get under your stencil and it won't have a nice clean edge. So squeeze your magic eraser out hard before you use it. And I found later that a scrubber, when you're painting on cold press paper anyway, works just as well with a stencil to get the same effect. So now I'm going to use my stiff scrubber. I do have videos about my stiff scrubber free on my YouTube channel. Just search my YouTube channel for scrubber. But I felt like this scrubber worked way better. And how cute is this bat stencil? So I'm going to use it in a couple ways. I'm going to use it to scrub away the bats, and I'm also going to use it to dot in some black bats. So this one little stencil has a bat on it, and I was looking at different ways of putting on paint and just floundering about like you should in your artistic process to try different things. And I used an 8, I think, well, that was a 6 round. It worked okay, but it was not perfect every time. It was easy to mess it up. And then I'm using more of a dry brush where I have barely any water in my heel. So that worked a little better, still not perfect. You really have to wipe off your stencil too on the bottom every time you put it down in a different spot, because it does get paint underneath it. It'll make a mess. So here's this stencil brush set, very super cheap brushes, super, super cheap. And this worked the best, getting just really cream consistency paint on my brush with barely any water in it, and making sure I didn't have hardly any water in my brush, and then dotting it on. So definitely test this out on the same paper that you're going to use on your painting, and just practice, because it's easy to mess this up. And what I do is I picked up some paint and then dabbed out my brush. I do believe I usually dabbed out my brush. Just experiment with what works best with the paint and paper that you're using, and just, you can't go in with drippy paint at all. It really needs to be cream consistency with just enough water added to it to be workable. And I'm trying to just orient my bats in a variety of angles. You don't want them all at the same flat angle. You want them, bat swoop here and there. And you want to make sure they're not flying out of your painting though. At the edges, notice that bats on the edges are flying into the painting. That's kind of important, just stylistically, just composition 101. Wherever an animal or person is looking, that's where your viewer is going to look. Wherever a bird is flying to, that's where your viewer is going to, it's like an arrow pointing your viewer's eye into the painting or to the area you want them to look at. So most of the bats are kind of flying towards the cat. But I am going to put some whiskers in with my white gel pen. This is a Signo Uniball Broad gel pen. And if you go to rachelstudio.com/supply list, You'll find all the links to all my supplies. And then, you know, I hate having whiskers stuck on looking, and I did find that if I use my stiff scrubber with a little bit of water, I could kind of incorporate those whiskers into the cat a little bit better. Oh, and by the way, these black furred out fluffy cats that I did this year, this painting and the one that I did last year as just a fun little tutorial to practice these skills. I did a painting just like this black cat inspired by this shirt that I found. And there are other shirts like this with this fabric, not this exact shirt, but like sweatshirt. So I will put a link in the description to an Amazon sweatshirt that has this design if you really need this in your life. And don't you think you need it? Yes, you do need it. All right, thank you so much for joining me for today's tutorial. Be sure to follow me if you want to learn not just the how, but the why of watercolor, so you move on your watercolor journey a lot faster. Check out my community tab. Often I post there a lot. Check out my free Facebook group. Come show me your paintings. I'd love to see them. And that is a free Facebook group, and I will put the link here. If you would like to learn from me more in depth and watch these tutorials that I've painted, this is a full real-time tutorial. This is a full, well, it's not real-time. I actually sped it up, but it's like an hour-long tutorial going in depth how I painted this. I hope you all have a safe, happy Halloween, and I will see you really soon. Now go watercolor your world. Bye, everybody.